The final thing that we looked at, which we were asked to look at by our terms of reference, was around young women and culturally diverse groups. One of the things that was most important to us, as I touched on earlier, was actually building an evidence base that we could use to support our thinking and also the recommendations that we'd come up with. Surprisingly, it's probably not surprising to you who are involved in the field, but to us who thought there would be ample literature and that it would all be nicely laid out for us, this was not the case. From a commercial perspective, that was a mistake, but it was also turned out to be a really important part of the journey for us, because it allowed us to look very closely at what's happened in the field and what evidence is out there. We looked at well over 450 articles and journals and papers, and I think we discarded large numbers even before we got to that figure, because they weren't, the evidence that we could see supporting them wasn't there. It then we went through a process of analysing and comparing and making judgments around it. And some of the things that we looked at around there were the quality of the evaluations that were undertaken, and the breadth of programs, how repeatable they'd been, the size of the samples that had been undertaken. One of the more interesting issues is around effectiveness, and we actually made judgments around how effective we thought these programs were. We've been quizzed a few times about that. The key thing is, what were the aims of this program and how well did it meet them? Were the outcomes durable? And was that documented? And then finally, how repeatable was the work that or the findings? Other jurisdictions, other countries, other groups, whatever. One of the most disappointing things was that there was a real paucity of information on Indigenous programs, and we were, I guess, shocked actually, given the importance of the Indigenous overrepresentation, the small body of work, comparatively small body of work that had been done, and the lack of evaluations on that. I'm sort of very pleased to see that the Attorney General's Department at the federal level have got a number of evaluations going on of some post-release programs and other programs, and I think that's a really important step for us in Australia if we're going to help close the gap. It was astounding in New South Wales, where we looked very closely at pilots and programs, how few of them had robust evaluation. And there's one program there that's been going for 9 years. It appears to be on the surface a very good program, but we really couldn't make any judgments on it because it hadn't been evaluated. Having worked quite widely across government, I see that often these pilots and programs get up because someone finds, $150,000 in the budget. It sounds like a good idea. Let's roll it out. And so we get a short-term program that is seldom evaluated. Our view on this is that it's a bit like travel insurance. If you can't afford travel insurance, you can't afford to travel. If you can't afford a robust evaluation, you can't afford to do the program. And I think that for policymakers, this is really important. The wide number of programs and that going on was astounding, and some of them sounded great, but they were so short, so bereft of robust evaluation. I think governments are wasting a lot of money. This is the table that we summarised all of that work to help actually give people a feeling for what's important and what should be considered. Firstly, evidence-based policy formation. I had a good meeting in Queensland yesterday where I was really pleased to hear that, particularly at the political level, there's a greater demand there for policy, so evidence-based advice, and one would have hoped that is always the case, but as we've pointed out, get tough approaches sound great, they make great sound bites, but the evidence is that they don't work. boot camps and the like. The evidence is very strong, and I'm sure some of you know far better than we do, that they just don't work. Incarceration, as I touched on previously, while necessary in some cases, and we position at the beginning of the paper, there are children and young people out there who must be locked up. The second thing is that children and young people must be made responsible for their offending behaviour. But incarceration needs to be a last resort. Comprehensive and complementary programming. It's very interesting when you see programs that overlap, or that there are gaps, and that they are not widespread. In New South Wales, for instance, and it's probably the same in all but the smallest jurisdictions, they are much more readily available in metropolitan areas, less so in regional areas, and hardly at all in remote areas. We need to do things differently for Indigenous and culturally diverse groups. Touched on whole of government collaboration before, and also whole of community. I think Victoria, again, I'm not holding up any one jurisdiction being any shining light, but Victoria does do the whole of community aspect very well. There are historical reasons for that, but it's something that all jurisdictions should emulate in our view.